Welcome, a quiet soul. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a small human were thrown into the heart of a civilization that was both terrifyingly orderly and incredibly brutal? Today, I invite you to follow such a journey, the journey of a slave in the Aztec Empire. A society where children were punished for dirtying the streets, where human fates were sometimes decided by a game of dodging poop, where dinner was always filled with insects and slave contracts were clearly stamped with terms and signatures, where a mispronounced name could open the door to death. In such a world, people were forced to choose run away from suspicious eyes, bow their heads and accept their role, or risk leaving a story memorable enough to survive the collective memory. But what does it really mean to survive if tomorrow no one remembers your existence? If all traces were swept away like dust from a stone floor after a rainstorm, would anyone stop, look back and call out the name of a person who once existed? Before we go deeper into this journey, ask yourself what in the story makes you pause. Is it the coldness of the law or the loneliness of a forgotten soul? If a detail touches you, feel free to leave a comment. A small thought could become the memory someone is looking for. And if you find this story worth retelling, share it or follow. Who knows, just one touch could spread a piece of history waiting to be remembered. The morning in Tenochtitlan is not silent. It opens with the sound of dry wood clanking together, the smell of smouldering ashes, wet grass from thatched roofs, and steam rising from the lake. The city does not need an alarm clock. A gesture is enough. The fish carrier tilts his shoulder. The children shout to each other. To go to the square, the fishmonger cracks a joke and the whole neighbourhood wakes up. On the back of the firewood carrier, sweat has not yet appeared, but the palms have already left clear traces of tar. Every step is familiar. Every turn is known by name. But even when familiarity has become the rhythm of breathing, Tenochtitlan is still a place where no one is allowed to forget their place. Children run past bamboo sticks in hand, shouting the punishment of washing the feet of the gods. By the charcoal stove, the sound of corn popping each ear is turned over to burn evenly wrapped in leaves and quickly carried away like a morning ritual. No one asks what to eat. Everyone knows that if you don't have a full stomach in the morning, you won't have enough energy to laugh if you squeeze into the square. But there is something very special about the way the Aztecs start their day. Not too hasty, not leisurely. Each person does his part, no one complains, no one brags. The salt carrier walks along the street, sweat running down his back, but still smiling when he sees his neighbours. The vegetable carrier adjusts the rope as he walks, his eyes still on the little girl trailing behind. Have you ever lived in a place like this? A place where every step is in sync with the rhythm of life? A place where every action, no matter how small, like wiping up water, giving way, or catching a basket of fish, is seen as part of the community. In the middle of the square, the drums have begun to beat. The sound is steady, not rushed. It is just a reminder that today is not like yesterday. Today is a ceremony. The ceremony here is not a decoration. It is the rope that holds the street together. From the child kicking a ball with a pumpkin to the old lady telling the story of last year's painful loss because she was one step too late. Everyone lives in the rhythm of the ceremony. Even the ball-throwing game has a ritualistic shadow. Whoever wins gets to eat cake, whoever loses has to be teased by the gods. Each match is a chance to see who the gods are watching. The old people gathered at the end of the street playing a game of sowing seeds and guessing numbers. The voices of the people chattering, the birds, the vegetable vendors, the sound of corn being turned on the coals, creating a harmony of life. The city did not sing, but it knew how to tell stories through sound. Everything went on like that until something went wrong. A group of strangers appeared. Their clothes were not like those of the market people. Their scarves were different. Their voices were not like those of everyday Tenochtitlan. And for a moment the whole street seemed to fall silent. No one shouted, no one ran, but the eyes began to change. The fishmonger clenched his fist to collect his baskets. The children stood against the pillars. The old people stopped working. Only one person was still holding a bundle of firewood. Their eyes, the whole group of strangers, began to rest on the slave. "Never seen you at mass before." The words fell into the air like a silent knife. The answer was given that he lived at the end of the street, that he got up early to carry firewood to the market, but the silence did not break. The children began to mumble, "I don't remember this guy playing football." One sentence, 2 sentences, then the whole street began to compare memories. No one shouted, but each person was weighing the familiarity with his own logic. Here there was a person who was absent from the collective memory, the one who needed to be questioned. Have you ever experienced that feeling? When a place that is supposed to be home suddenly puts you in an interrogation chair because no one remembers your face, when every gaze waits for you to prove that you belong here, silence spreads like mushrooms after a rain. From the fishmonger to the soccer-loving child, from the old man tying bird cages to the corn seller, everyone is waiting for something convincing enough to return to normal. But Tenochtitlan does not forget quickly. This city does not outright reject anyone, but it silently observes, remembers and tests. Just a strange sign, a voice, a way of walking, a mistimed glance is enough to throw the city off centre. The bundle of firewood in the slave's hand suddenly feels heavy. The air thins. The drums in the square beat faster. The event is about to happen. And strangely, even though no one announced it, everyone knows that person will be the main character. Not because they were prepared, but because it was chosen implicitly, automatically, by the eyes of a community that was both suspicious and waiting. Isn't it strange? A city that didn't need a criminal code, guards could still turn a look into a sentence and a question into a screening ritual. Tenochtitlan didn't use words to warn. It used taunts. And that silence was sometimes the scariest thing of all. The streets suddenly opened up as if the space had been stretched. All the voices became quieter. Eyes turned in one direction. The stranger who had intended to pass quietly by became the focal point of the entire morning. The locals instinctively parted, leaving a clear space between the rest of the community and the man holding a bundle of firewood in the middle of the street. In this place, silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was a warning signal. Then suddenly a child stepped out. Eyes wide, voice coming out naturally without any filter. "Why is your face like that? Are you from across the lake?" The question was like a knock on the already cracked surface. And so the children joined in. Some craned their necks to observe others, tilted their heads as if searching for clues. "Do you know how to sing lullabies or just throw balls?" A series of innocent questions, but each word was like an unofficial background check. The way children used the language of the festival to examine strangers was how Tenochtitlan protected its structure. The slave just nodded, squeezed through the crowd, wanting to blend into the old rhythm of life. But misfortune always appeared from the smallest things. A wrong step, a collision, and then a basket of fish crashed onto the stone floor. Water spilled out, the smell of raw fish seemed to tear the air. The live fish were still jumping, each drop splashing on the bare feet of the children who had just rushed over. The old woman holding the basket shouted loudly in a shrill Nahuatl accent, the words flying out like knives. "Who's blocking the way? My fish are for the gods, not for anyone to kick away." The crowd held their breath. The slave bent down to pick up each fish, trying to explain. But not a single word was enough to erase the fishy smell clinging to his sleeve. A young man nearby sneered, adding, "So the people on the other side of the lake really are. The people of this village have known how to avoid old people since they could walk." Another young man, thin, pushed his friend's shoulder and said, "The gods must have sent them to test us. Let's see who can tolerate strangers." The atmosphere changed from harmony to judgment. All it took was one slip. The children scrambled to pick up the fish as if they were playing a game of stealing the first fortune of the year. The adults stopped laughing. A woman standing nearby shook her head, muttering, "If the gods get angry, our people will have a bad harvest all year." Have you ever seen a minor accident blown out of proportion? You try to explain in the local language you've learned by heart. Talk about paying for the fish, go to the village market, but just one mispronounced syllable, one word pronounced out of rhythm enough to make people's eyes narrow, then shake their heads. "You lisp clearly not from here." A child shouts loudly, "I saw someone who looks like you at the old market yesterday." The seemingly harmless remark adds another stone to the scale of suspicion. The slave stands up straight, his hand smelling of fish. His gaze has no room to dodge. The young men form a semicircle. One of them, broad shoulders, deep voice, steps forward. "Where are you from? What's your name? Who's your family? Why haven't we seen you at the ballpark or the shrine?" The answer is drawn from the information overheard the night before, lives near the edge of the lake. Father fishes, mother weaves, but each statement was another piece of evidence against it. One person laughed loudly, another stranger sent by the gods. Last year it was a fortune teller, this year it's you. The story spread like wildfire. Another fishmonger whispered, "Take him to the square and ask the gods to be sure." A vegetable girl glanced at her friend. "Have you ever heard what the gods said? Here we ask them about everything." Each word gradually removed the cover around the suspect. Everything suddenly turned into questioning. Each statement was like verifying a scenario that the slave was not invited to act out, and then, without further ado, a large man the guard appeared. His hand was firmly on his spear. His expression did not need to be harsh. He just said, "Follow me, I need to hear your story." Have you ever been in that situation? When the choice was no longer a choice, the two lines of people parted automatically. The street became a path. An old man lifted a chair and sat on the edge of the wall, resting his chin on it, muttering, "Something is about to happen in this village." The drums beat again in a rush as if urging the slave to move. No one pushed, but no one allowed him to stop. A voice rose from the crowd. "Just tell the truth. I will protect the righteous." The advice was not exactly comfort, more like a declaration. There was no escape from lying here. The slave followed the guard, his throat as dry as stone. Behind him was the whole street sending him off with its eyes. The people no longer looked on with curiosity, but with anticipation. The waiting is like watching a play where the main character is not yet clear. Have you ever become the main character when you are only the audience? A child rushes forward, grabs the hem of his shirt and asks loudly, "Will you come back to play when you go to the temple?" The slave smiles, slightly forced. "Someday you will beat me at throwing balls." The children clap their hands. A light beat in the middle of a tense climax. The guard walks ahead, mumbling something about gods and responsibilities. The villagers silently follow with their eyes. The old woman who lost her fish mumbles, "Who knows, meeting a stranger might be a blessing." In front is the square. Behind is the gaze of the entire city evaluating a person of unknown origin will be kept or will he be left to the gods to decide. The festival continues, but for the slave today is no longer an ordinary day. And in Tenochtitlan, an unusual day is sometimes the beginning of a destiny. The slave was carried along by the crowd like a leaf in a flood. No one touched him, but hundreds of eyes were strong enough to hold the stranger's steps. The guard's fingers rested on his shoulders, light as the wind, but pushed him straight to the centre of the square where the gods resided, and the verdict could not be denied. The crowd whispered each word, breaking like bubbles on the surface of a lake. Some recognized a face they had never known. Some repeated the old story of a stranger who had appeared the year before, also in the crowd, also in the sound of drums, and in the end it turned out to be a good omen. The village chief stepped out from the direction of the great temple. His red cloak covered his body, his long face cold as a stone mask. His voice rang out deep and firm like a staff touching a rock. In front of the villagers, in front of the gods, he gave the slave two paths to fate. One was to become a servant of the temple, hands, knees, breath, all belonging to the temple. The other was to try his luck on the escape route, a straight run out of the city with only one condition: clean feet. Clean, free. The whole village held its breath. Children chattered. Mothers whispered. Old people nodded. A public test in broad daylight under the eyes of the subjects and the bright sunlight of Tenochtitlan. A joke of the gods or a test of fate. The slave said nothing. He just took a deep breath, looking at the cobblestone road that wound through 3 rows of houses leading straight to the city gate. On both sides of the road, baskets of corn were tilted corn husks, scattered beetle carcasses, wet mud, even a few streaks of undried feces. A pack of small dogs lay by the wall, ears pricked, as if waiting for the unannounced performance. The drums beat. At first, a steady rhythm, then a rapid rhythm like a person's heart beating wildly. The whole village backed away, giving way to a straight, narrow path, but enough for a man to test his luck. The slave did not hesitate any longer. He chose to run, not because he believed he was fast enough, but because what was more terrifying than failure was to live a life of slavery with hands that were never raised. The drum beat into the heart of the street. The first push brought silence, then a scream from a corner, and he rushed forward. The first stone touched his foot, then the second, the third. The slave stretched, dodging 2 old women standing on the sidewalk, dodging a group of children who suddenly crossed the street. A pack of dogs chased each other, behind growling loudly, barking loudly throughout the neighbourhood. He ran close to the wall, trying to avoid every trace of brown moisture that remained under his feet. Every step was a judgment from the gods, every stone a mystery. Beneath his feet, the wet moss made the stone surface slippery as oil. His eyes darted around, searching for dark spots, invisible traps that the village knew, but not him. A few steps, he almost missed a few times. He twisted his ankle, but he kept his footing. Cheers erupted on the roadside, baskets of corn fell. People clapped, others whistled. The first bend appeared, the heartbeats faster. The smell of grilled corn, dried fish and wood smoke mixed together. A muddy trail crossed the road. A child threw a stick of firewood near his feet accidentally, or on purpose, no one knew. He dodged in time, the tip of his foot skimmed the stone surface, breathing hard, his heart pounding in his throat. A dog suddenly jumped diagonally across the road. He reflexively dodged to the right, his left foot slipped hard, one of his sandals flew off his foot. His bare feet landed. He glanced down, and then the fateful brown trail appeared. A thin, not long wet enough, real enough. A loud ooh sounded like crashing waves. An old man whistled. The fishmonger woman laughed. The children shouted regretfully. The crowd broke out not in anger or pity, but because the performance had come to an end with the final slide right before the finish line. The drumbeat slowed, became deeper like a sigh. The headman stepped forward. Not heavy, not stern, just a conclusion witnessed by the god. The slave looked down at his feet, his thumbs smeared with feces. Sweat trickled down his temples. But he smiled. A small smile mixed with bitterness and acceptance. A child pressed a roasted corn cob into his hand. Without anyone telling him, everyone accepted the outcome. The god had chosen. Every fall had a reason. And to the Aztecs, the precision of fate lay in the smallest detail, even a stain. The slave walked toward the guards. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes did not bow. The crowd dispersed, but the echoes lingered. Each step he took was a wordless lesson. Luck does not save for her. And sometimes a whole life can change direction with just a short slip. The slaves were sent to live with a family on the southern edge of Tenochtitlan, a residential area crowded with alleys filled with the smell of roasted corn and ash smoke. The three-room house, roofed with dried corn husks and the yard littered with chicken feathers and cold kitchen ashes, did not look like any authority. But in Aztec society, power was never expressed through gold and silver, but was always quietly hidden behind petty habits. People often imagined slaves as bodies writhing in chains, bare backs bleeding from the whip, or eyes filled with hopelessness. But here slave life was like working without a contract, except that the work continued without stopping. In the morning, grinding corn until hands were calloused at noon, sweeping the yard full of chicken waste in the afternoon, scrubbing mossy pots, and at night searching for worms in the garden. Yes, worms. Fat worms, soft worms, hard-shelled worms, worms buried under large leaves in damp corners of the garden. The longer the insect lived, the more nutritious it was, and the longer the slave lives, the harder it is to catch. While the slave crouched between the tree roots, the smell of damp soil clinging to his collar. The children in the master's house cheered as if they were watching a game. Some of them were still chewing corn cakes, pointing and recalling the memory of the last time the slave stepped on a fire ant nest. That memory, his legs swollen as a gourd, was still clearly imprinted with each step of sweeping the yard with a crooked banana broom handle. But no one scolded me. No one pitied him, either. The master just smiled faintly, saying that as long as the yard was clean, sweeping with his feet was fine. That sentence, seemingly unintentional, made the slave ponder all afternoon. If slave life was so easy, would there be anything missing in the books? While scrubbing pots in the evening, whispers from the front room drifted in like a puff of acrid smoke. Someone had just been turned into a slave because he had insulted a servant. The story was simple: a master cursed in the market, and the next day he was taken away to be a slave. The crime is not violence but arrogance in front of others. Here words are the knife and the witness is the hand holding the scale. So in Aztec society, could a slap change a life? That question haunted the slave all night. Was there an unwritten law that defined the boundary between worked and owned? Who had the power to reverse fate and whose voice had enough weight to make the gods bend down to examine every crack in the wall of order? The answer ironically lay in the eyes of others. If someone listened, if they believed, then anger could become a weapon. If not, then the fingernails would continue to scratch the ground for worms and the eyes would continue to get used to the sight of blood stuck between the fingers. That night, the slave lay quietly on the hard-as-a-board reed mat, listening to the crickets chirping, looking at the dark ceiling. The tattoos on his hands, drawn by the children with charcoal, looked like a distorted sun. The landlady had thrust a piece of cornbread into his hand that afternoon. Everyone in the house tried to speak more slowly so he could catch up with the unfamiliar Nahuatl. There were no ropes, no whips, no one forcing him to bow his head, so was this a prison or a comical release? The next morning he sat grinding corn again. The sound of stones grinding against each other was like a silent mantra. His hands were sore, but the thin porridge had soothed his stomach. The owner came over, patted his shoulder and said that in a few days he would be able to go out to harvest. A simple promise, but enough to make him nod. Compared to digging for worms, harvesting corn sounded like a promotion. After all, corn at least didn't run away. But then, A question popped into his head. What if one day he wanted to leave? Before the question could be put into words, the owner answered, as if he had heard it. Anyone who knew how to grind corn and wash pots had a place in Tenochtitlan. Here origins didn't matter. The city was small, but it never closed its doors. That statement, which sounded benevolent, was actually a soft trap. A place that could hold people back with kindness was more dangerous than iron chains. Suddenly, the sound of drums sounded from the side street. The old man, who usually boiled water in the kitchen, washed his hands quickly. The whole area was preparing to go to the ceremony. The slave was called, not forced, not chosen. People poured into the square one by one, from house to house, like a regular stream toward the centre of the ceremony. What would the god test next? No one knew, but the slave knew one thing for sure. If there was anything he had learned in the past few days, it was the ability to pick up worms without vomiting. And in the Aztec world, that was sometimes more important than the oath. A fire was burning in the backyard of a residential area near the temple, where dry logs crackled, as if trying to hold on to the last sound before turning to ash. The slave sat silently among the people who had known each other, from counting rice, grinding corn, gathering firewood and picking worms. They came from different paths, each with his own reasons, but now they gathered in a circle around the half-burnt red light where no one was superior to the other, and no one was too strange. The one who used to be a merchant now sat with his knees propped up, chewing each charred corn kernel. The one who was born into a silversmith family now only held a small wooden bead, plucking it, steadily counting each beat as if recording the last breath of the day. There were eyes that once shone with desire, now smouldering like ashes, but deep inside there was still something that had not yet died. No one asked each other why they came here, but every gesture, every way of putting wood into the fire or resting an arm on a knee seemed to tell a part of the past story. In Tenochtitlan, slavery was not always the result of failure. Some people voluntarily signed up, exchanging a few years of hard work for the chance to redeem themselves with proper paperwork. There are people who run away from debt, people who avoid punishment, people who are tired of life on the other side of the lake. They enter this circle of fire by themselves. No one ties them up, no one forces them. Those who choose to stay often say that at least here they can breathe, can put their feet on the doorstep, can sit and tell stories every night without fear of being knocked on the head and asked why. The story of redemption is not a legend. People still talk about a girl named Vengsa who carried water for the temple for 3 years, then left with a certificate in hand, opened a grilled corn shop right next to the big market. People in the area say that the shop has never been empty of customers because the seller knows how to survive even the sacrificial ceremonies. Among these people, the choice becomes a privilege, not because they are free, but because they know what they are trading. In a society where death can come just because of offending the wrong person, being able to choose the time to leave, being able to count each month of work is a rare form of security. Some even asked for a renewal of their contracts, because here they were no longer prey to gossip or inherited debt. The slaves sat quietly, letting the firelight sweep over their frayed shoulders. Questions that had been swallowed by survival instincts gradually emerged in their minds. If they disappeared tomorrow, would anyone remember them? Would anyone carve their names in stone? Would anyone burn incense? Would anyone tell the story? One person in the circle once said that what they feared most was not whips or forced labour, but being forgotten. A life that, when extinguished, left nothing but a pile of ashes swept into a corner of the yard. That was why every night someone sat here, lit a fire and talked about it. Even if it was just a fragment of memory, a failed harvest, a failed love affair, a slip during a ceremony, all were gathered together, like dry corn kernels burned to make fire and warmed each other. In Aztec society, honour was not reserved for slaves, but the contract bearers still cling to one thing: shared memories do not die. No need for statues or prayers. Sometimes just one person telling it one name, remembering it, is enough to keep the charcoal mark from fading. As the wind blew through the yard, blowing a leaf off the steps, the slave looked into the circle of fire and suddenly understood the scary thing is not living in shackles, but living until the end of life without anyone knowing that he existed. So among the glowing logs he leaned forward to pick up another piece, pushing the fire a little higher, as if to say that he was still here. The night passed slowly but not sadly, and if tomorrow someone disappeared from this circle of people, at least they had sat together, among the fire, among the ashes, among the stories that did not need to be recorded. This world, although it divided status by beauty, blood, or debt, could not deny one thing: as long as someone dared to tell, that memory still lived. And a slave, as long as he was heard, was never anonymous. That morning, the drums resounded from the central square like thunder reverberated straight into the stone arch, rumbling down to the ground. The entire residential area seemed to be jolted out of its sleep. The smell of ash incense and the early morning mist mixed in the air, carrying an indescribable feeling. The slave had just brought a basket of freshly milled corn and had not yet lit the stove when he saw a stream of people rushing out into the street. Some were carrying water, others were wrapping cloth flags around poles, children were leading each other, shouting like they were going to a festival. Everything was bright, but there was a kind of restlessness hidden within it, as if this festival was not only to offer to the gods, but also to clarify someone's fate. The order to summon the reserve men was passed down as quickly as fire. Those who had once carried contracts were now pulled into separate lines. A guard holding a list, his face as cold as carved stone, shouted briefly, "Reserve for the sacrifice, stand by name." The slave had no time to say anything, and there was no way back. His hands were still covered in cornflour, his feet were covered in ash, but he was already standing in the middle of the line of people being decided. In front, a man was panting like a buffalo being led out into a strange field. Behind, an old woman as thin as a bundle of dry wood, her eyes still bright, quietly clasped her hands as if praying for someone else, not herself. The square was as bright as a painting, but each beat of the stone drum penetrated the hearts of people like a countdown. A large incense stick stuck in the middle of the yard was burning fiercely. Above, a person holding a list as long as a dry bamboo stalk began to call out each name. Each word bounced off like a knife cutting the stone surface. Some stepped forward silently, others trembled and could not stand. But everyone was silent. In Tenochtitlan, resistance was not forbidden. It was just useless. The slave lowered his head. Sweat soaked his back, but he did not dare wipe it. The words that had been passed down from before came back to him. If your name is called, do not resist, do not retreat, do not argue. I see everything, and I hate resistance. But something unexpected happened. When the announcer loudly read out a strange word, a child from the front row jumped up shouting, "Wrong!" The whole square seemed to freeze. The wind stopped, the fire quieted. The list was turned over, the soldier checked the records again. And then, with a slight nod, fate was reversed. Not the slave, just a duplicate name. A small mistake, but enough to push a life to the edge. And at that very moment, the slave was pushed to the edge of the yard like a returned item. No one comforted him, no one explained. Only the dizziness that hit his chest, and the drums beat again, calling the next person's name. The slave sat down next to the stone wall out of breath, his eyes cloudy. A young man passed by and muttered something, but his ears could no longer hear clearly. His chest felt like it was being pressed down by a mountain of stone. Have you ever survived because of a spelling mistake? Has a wrong syllable ever saved a life? For the slave, that moment opened up a new awareness. It was not death that was the most terrifying thing. It is the realization that one's existence is entirely dependent on an order, that one does not understand, valid or not correct or incorrect, name withdrawal or retention. Everything is beyond one's control. And if there is another ceremony tomorrow, will the gods remember that they have spared it last time? The question pierces the heart, bringing a chill to the back of the neck. 1 minute one is standing in the laurels of the ancient ritual, the next minute one is being pushed aside. It is like being granted the grace to continue living but not knowing how to live. The morning sun is still shining. The fire is still burning, people continue to line up. And the slave sitting silently looks at the basket of corn placed next to him. Something that seems useless, but turns out to be a reminder. Maybe there is still something to continue doing. Whether it is carrying water, lighting a fire or picking worms, at least those tasks have rules, a rhythm, a way out. Because surviving by luck is one thing, but surviving that good fortune is the real challenge. That morning the city awoke to a different scent. Not the smoke of sacrifices, not the salty taste of blood on the stone altar, but something very different: cleanliness. The scent of soapberry leaves, powdered bark, and the wind from the lake blew through the market square as if the gods themselves had just cleansed all of Tenochtitlan. The slaves woke earlier than usual, not because of nightmares, nor the familiar sound of drums, but because the air was so strange that it forced their minds to stay awake. The cobblestone streets were shining in the early morning sun. 2 children were bending over, rubbing each tile with palm leaves, muttering the familiar hygiene curse. Each clean stone was not just a material, but a mark here. Cleanliness was sacred. On the street, a mother raised her hand to warn her child who had just tried to urinate behind a tree. Every behaviour had a standard, and every violation had consequences. In Tenochtitlan, public shame was worse than divine punishment. The Aztec city was once associated with skull's blood and sacred stones. But the longer the slaves lived, the more they realized that this was only the surface. The layer below operated by a different order, meticulous, disciplined, and somewhat cold. Not everyone understood the reason, but everyone acted as if they were being watched at all times. A stain on their clothes, a drop of beetle nut dropped to spit in the wrong place was enough to be recorded in the penalty book. Some were forced to clean up excrement, some were scrubbing temples, some were forced to stand shirtless, in the middle of the summer, under the order to expose their shame. And the scariest thing was, no one complained. The lakeside market was bustling as usual. The corn tortillas were still hot, the fruits were neatly displayed, and the feathers were arranged by colour, but every step, every glance was cautious, as if every action was being judged in silence. The slogans hanging on the market walls repeated the idea of cleanliness is virtue, making people both respect and suffocate. An old woman peeling papaya shouted loudly when she saw someone spitting beetle juice on the ground. Those reactions were no longer anger, but survival instinct in a city where everything was regulated down to the ashes on their clothes. The slave had thought that order would be his salvation. But the longer he lived, the more he saw that it carried with it a silent punishment, the denial of all the chaos within. No one spoke of sadness, no one complained of loneliness, no one told of a terrifying dream, because those things were unclean. And what was unclean needed to be covered up, by silence, by rules, by beautiful forms and bright streets. An old man sat leaning on a stick in front of the temple. His face was deeply etched with time, his eyes looking far away. He did not need to say anything. His presence was enough to remind him that time never deceives anyone. Underneath that layer of cleanliness were wrinkles that no god could hide. Weary eyes, dreams forced to lie still, unnamed losses. All exist amidst the rules and rituals that the city proudly built. The slave stood up, continuing to walk through the neighbourhood like a shadow, no longer unfamiliar, but not yet truly belonging. The morning light reflected off the clean stone floor to the point that it could illuminate the quiet doubts in his heart. Here everyone kept their clothes clean, kept their words neat, and kept their faces expressionless. But no one taught them how to keep their hearts from being dirty. This city, though majestic, did not allow for chaos inside. And perhaps because of that, the slave learned one thing to survive in a place so clean that it was cold one needed to keep something dirty enough to make oneself human. A charcoal stain on the sleeve, a restless memory, an unnamed fear that was fine. No one needed to shed blood to be remembered. Sometimes just living long enough, looking deep enough, and quietly placing yourself among the unnamed crowd is enough to become part of the Aztec memory. Dusk descended slowly over the lake. The last rays of sunlight spread thinly like beeswax over the water, sparkling as if the place had never been stained with blood from the sacrifices. Amid the red glow of the fire dripping embers onto the ground, they sat together, with people who had divided corn, sharpened knives, scrubbed floors, and escaped death from the stone table. No one gave orders anymore, no drums or prayers, only broken laughter, the crackling of fish in the lake, and small stories that seemed lost amid the smoke of the sacrifices. One recounted the story of a man named Mexi from Tlaxcala. His mother ran after the sacrifices, offering to die in their place. But when they got there, no one remembered his name. The sacrifices went on, and the mother disappeared. The story broke in two amid the crackling of rotten wood. A girl turned the corn cake in her hand and asked softly, "If no one remembers at your name, how can you live?" An old man sneered, not looking at anyone, and said loudly, "It doesn't matter how you live. As long as when you die, there will still be people to remember you." No one interfered. Each person only kept a part of their memory. A night of running away because they slipped on dung. A time when they thought they were being sacrificed alive. A cold afternoon of rubbing a jar with scratched hands, hungry and tired, but still singing softly because someone had shared half a hot corn cob. Some people even remembered the smell of burning straw during the festival. Some people only remembered a quiet gaze through the temple curtain when it was about to rain. They did not talk about freedom, did not talk about faith. They only asked each other the simplest thing, how to not be forgotten. A skinny man affirmed the scariest thing is not being enslaved or being sacrificed alive. It is something that no one remembers. No one engraves a name, no one burns incense, no one recalls the times you lived. The death of the body is not as heavy as the death in the memory of others. A boy sitting nearby muttered, I wish someone would tell me later that he used to bake the best cakes in the market. Another girl hoped only that one day someone would recall her voice, even if only once. No one talked about fame, no one hoped to become a king or a priestess. They only hoped to leave something behind a story, airing a name in someone's memory. The slave did not answer. He just sat there, listened, and then bowed his head slightly. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood. Surviving in the Aztecs did not mean running faster, bowing better, or being a better flatterer. Surviving in the Aztecs was leaving something that others would want to tell. A timely smile, a greeting when it was cold, a time cleaning the kitchen for someone who was feverish, a small dot in a forest of words that had been erased. And then as the fire burned down, the night wind blew through the corn-thatched roofs and people began to disperse. The slave raised his head and looked at the dark lake. He no longer asked if anyone remembered him, because if you can still ask, it means there are still people who remember. The Aztecs did not live easily, but no one lives forever. The only thing left is the story, and the story needs someone to tell. And once someone remembers that existence, whether slave prisoner or floor scrubber becomes freedom. Not the freedom that is granted, but the freedom that is engraved in memory. If you had lived in the Aztecs, how would you choose to not be forgotten? Would you tell stories, write your name, or just leave a share of corn? And if today, in this modern world, someone remembers an anonymous person who once carried water under the shadow of the temple, then is that memory still alive? If you find this story worth remembering, leave a comment. And share this video so that once again that slave can live in someone's memory.